A warning. This episode contains descriptions of violent crime, interpersonal violence and sexual assault. Please listen with care.
A listener production.
When victims share their stories, it's often with the hope that no one else will have to endure what they did. It's about raising awareness, spotting the red flags, and ensuring that those in power take your concerns seriously. These themes are also at the heart of every story we share on this podcast. This is Crime Insiders, what we've learned about staying safe. In this episode, we're drawing on the expertise of law enforcement professionals who have seen crimes unfold and unravelled the chain of events that led to them. This episode isn't just a conversation about safety, it's a toolkit for empowerment. By learning from these experts, you can be better prepared to recognise threats and take proactive measures to protect yourself and your loved ones. We'll begin with Narelle Fraser, who spent nearly 3 decades with the Victorian Police. Many of those years were dedicated to investigating child abuse and sex offences. On Crime Insiders Detectives, Narelle told Brent about the importance of trusting your instincts, documenting suspicious activity, and ensuring police take your concerns seriously. Her persistence in identifying a young potential offender emphasises the value of acting early on red flags.
Could I ask from your perspective, from an investigative perspective, what would your advice be to someone listening in who's listening to this and thinking, oh goodness, I came home the other week and took the washing off the line and there was a couple of clothes pegs there and there was no clothing, and I think I might have had somebody that's taken some underwear thinking, but I didn't really think anything of it. What would your advice be to folks listening in?
A couple of things. To at least tell someone, to write it down, diarise it, but also, obviously, to go to the police. And they could go to the police to say, look, this is going to sound really bizarre, but there's something going on around my house I feel you should know about. And make sure the police, they don't have to, have 10,000 police going to the house and doing all these investigations. Sometimes just to tell the police to know, so that they have it noted somewhere. And look, some police will probably say, oh, that's terrible. Look, come back if it gets any worse, or give us a call. If they get that response, I would suggest they actually ask, could I speak to a supervisor? And make sure that report is somehow noted on the police system and not by some young Connie at the desk that doesn't really think it's anything to be concerned about. The fact that the person is concerned enough to go to the police, and I understand a lot of people would think it's going to come across as sounding like I'm a bit of a drama queen, or, I'm a bit sensitive. Well, so be it. But make sure people know. I was going to say another thing, which probably is a bit hyper security-wise, but I'd probably take a photo with my phone of the pegs without the underwear. I don't know, but anything to just have something to show the police. Because if the parents of that young girl where the washing was strewn across the driveway, if they hadn't have insisted that their daughter tell the police would never have known that. And I hate to think what that young man, I said that before, I hate to think what he would have progressed to if he hadn't been stopped. Yeah. Because he was in my view, he was well on the way to serious sexual offending.
And Possibly too, if the relationship that you have, and some do and some don't with neighbours, if you know that you've got, a few neighbours that you can speak to quite openly, maybe that's a bit of a discussion to have with them as well. Hey, look, I came home on Wednesday, noticed this, I don't know, have you noticed anything? And it's like you say, oftentimes you went door knocking, house to house, very close to where this young offender lived. You found 2, 3 or 4 people who had individually experienced similar things, but nobody had spoken to anyone else about it. And we understand that because of the nature of it. But maybe in listening to this interview, folks may be more inclined to do that. The other thing that I would sort of say too is, and you did touch on this, if the police change shift quite regularly, and I often say to folks, if you've had the misfortune of maybe dealing with a police officer who, for whatever reason, doesn't quite connect with the concerns that you have, go back in at another time. And as you say, raise it to a high level. It's the squeaky wheel that gets oiled, isn't it? And stand your ground, because the young person that you speak to is respectfully probably the first rung on the ladder. There's always going to be a shift sergeant, a shift senior sergeant, and somebody a little higher. And if you speak out, you will inevitably get that complaint taken at a higher level. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I was just going to say then as well, to trust your instincts. Like, if you don't think there's something quite right and you feel a bit uncomfortable about what's going on at home, trust yourself. You're probably right. And that's where I would persevere. And if you're not satisfied with the attention that you're getting from, let's say, the person that you initially go to at the police station, well, persevere.
Yeah.
Ask to speak to the supervisor.
Yeah.
And the supervisor will generally come out, what's your problem? I just want to make sure this is noted.
If there was anybody listening into this and they're starting to make a connection possibly with that and a person that is perhaps that they know or could be a member of their family or extended family, what advice would you have for that person, Narelle?
Again, I suppose it's about trusting your instincts. And I think parents generally have a bit of a radar about their kids, and if one kid is, acts a little bit different or they're concerned about their behaviour, there's so many professional support services. I would be thinking of going to speak to somebody about your son or your daughter's behaviour, or anybody, but I would seek some professional advice. They might be able to give you some tools to work with and to sort of identify, but also be realistic, like circling back to the young 12-year-old stalker. If you've got to put a lock on your child's door to protect them from one of their siblings, there's something very, very wrong there. And I mean, there's young kids that are trying to assert their authority and they're getting, angry or emotional or whatever. That's normal stuff, but not to the point of, that's just one big step, isn't it? And, do some of your own research. Like you talk about when you do your sexual offending, you do research. I do research. Like learn about it. And also speak to the child. Talk to them. What's ever happened to actually sitting down with your kids and saying, what's all that about? Tell me, is there something that you're angry about? Talk to me. There's nothing you can't tell me that, all that sort of stuff. Sometimes I think we avoid the most obvious, which is talking to the child. Is something wrong? I notice that you're getting really angry. I notice that you're in your room a lot. Have you been watching some pornography? I don't know. Just have that conversation.
Former New South Wales Police Detective Peter Seymour dedicated years of his career to investigating horrific crimes. He thought he'd seen it all. Then a stranger started harassing his wife. In an interview with Brent, Peter provides guidance for women facing harassment, from recognising patterns to reporting effectively. Peter stresses the importance of not dismissing your own safety concerns. Take a listen.
It was early in our marriage. We got married in 1985. I'd moved to Penrith Detectives in 1986, and Sue fell pregnant with the first pregnancy around that time. And I was doing a lot of landscaping at our house. We were on a sloping block, and I was doing wanted to do a lot of bushrock landscaping, retaining and that. And so I looked up, I got a guy out of the local paper who had a lease at a property and sold bushrock, and ended up getting a couple of loads from him. And in hindsight, what had happened was that in working out delivery times when I could be there, we just got discussing, what I did. Told him I was in the police. And so what had happened is he would ring the police station at Penrith and ask for me. And if I was on afternoon shift starting at 3 o'clock, he'd ring after that when I wasn't home. If I was on day shift and finishing at 5, he'd ring around that time. And what it turned out, the second lot of rocks he delivered with his brother, and Sue was the one at home, and she brought out drinks. It was apparently a hot day. I wasn't there. And for some reason, he would start ringing her at these times when he knew I wasn't there, and saying he was watching her and that he was going to rape her and how he was going to do it and all these sorts of things. As it turned out, we found he was ringing from his girlfriend's home. And so we went through a process where Sue would have whistles, and she'd just blow the whistle as loudly as she could through the phone, and it didn't deter him. But then he'd go weeks without ringing again. And so you'd just get comfortable thinking, it was a one-off prank, some idiot. And then she'd get another call. And it really rocked her, as it would, a young girl, 22 years of age. She honestly thought that she was being watched because he knew when she was home and all that sort of stuff. At that time, Susie was pregnant, and during the whole course of these phone calls, she ended up having a miscarriage. The doctor said, look, she was really stressed out, and in my mind, that was a big part of it, if not the reason for it, what she was going through at the time. And as a husband, it's hard enough to see your wife dealing with this and not knowing how to fix it, but at least I was in a position in my career in my job as a police officer that I had the ability to do more about it than someone who was relying on someone else to do something. And the boss at Penrith, he gave me permission to work solely on that, put everything aside, on the proviso that when the time came that we had someone for it and we found who was doing it, I naturally had to step aside.
Sure.
And that was a logical thing.
Yeah.
It had to be done. So, I went through everything. I thought initially, because Susie was a school teacher, it might have been someone from through the school, went right through that, came up with nothing. In the end, I was able to get a listening device on the phone. We were able to track where the call came from. And again, that meant nothing to any of us because, as I said, he was ringing from his girlfriend's house. And I got to the point where I was left with nothing more than to bring the woman in. She was, I think, renting the house out there in one of the Mount Druitt suburbs.
And she'd be totally unaware that this was going on, obviously.
Had no idea.
And you're still at this point, there's no connection that you're making at this point to this bloke that delivered rocks to your joint months and months before.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
So we were left with no other alternative but to bring her in. Calls were coming from her place. So we brought her in. I was working at St Mary's Detectives at the time. Brought her in, interviewed her, to the point where through my questioning of her, we established that the only male person that ever came to her house was her boyfriend. I then told her what the investigation was about and where's your boyfriend? And see, I knew him from the ad as Bob. She told me his name was Robert. And then
Still no connection at that point?
At that time, still no connection. It's a name. Anyway, she said, he's at his grandparents' place. Can I go and get him? And I thought, well, that's good. I can buy a bit of time here. I said, you got half an hour. Bring him in or we're coming to get him. And that way I was able to ring the boss, get another couple of the detectives back, and I briefed them up on everything, and they were ready to go. And
you could step back at that stage.
And I step back, step out of it, and leave it to them to do the interviewing.
If we've got somebody listening and going, okay, what would I do if I picked up that phone and I was receiving those calls, or I felt that somebody was following me or stalking me or outside the house? Peter, what would your advice be to any women listening in?
Report it to police and be in a position as best you can to give them as much information as you can. If you've got someone, say in this case with this guy ringing my wife, as best you can, a description of the voice, whether it sounds like a young person, old person, even some things like if they have a bit of a stutter or anything that may assist the police down the track. Because I've been involved in many investigations where there was a series of rapes on women, and there were 4 victims in it. They all said the same thing. The offender wasn't circumcised. So information like that, it might not sound or seem important or relevant at the time, but it's vitally important to police. So any information over the phone that you can, if you hear a particular noise in the background, but you need to report it. And if you're not comfortable going there on your own, tell someone straight away and get them to go with you.
So don't think that there's nothing that can be done. Don't think, I don't want to bother the police. Don't think this won't be taken seriously. Look, I think I can speak for the majority of decent police. They would much rather hear about something like this before it sort of escalates than afterwards.
That's 100%.
It's no secret that the internet has become a weapon for perpetrators of abuse. It's an area that former detective and cybersecurity expert Rose MacDonald has dedicated her career to stamping out. In an interview with Kathryn Fox, Rose shared vital tips for protecting yourself and your family online. From managing metadata in social media posts to spotting signs of spyware on devices, Rose underscores the critical role of awareness in preventing digital abuse.
In terms of protecting our own children, it's a major concern with social media. And I'm often floored by how many people post photos of their children in school uniforms, in identifiable places. The dance group, have their logo on their shirts. What are they potentially exposing themselves and their children to?
Again, it's a good question because I think the research talks a lot about dangers of within family environments and so forth, more so than external. But we can't get away from the fact that there are people in our society who do look for material to post. And when I guess it's just an awareness, be cognizant of the information that you're going to put out online. A lot of social media applications these days do strip metadata, so whilst it's still possible in many instances to find the geolocations of material, sometimes it's stripped, and so that's a good thing that it's not as readily available. But have a look at the images that you're posting. What identifying information is there in that image? And as you rightly point out, if you're in a particular school uniform, if you're posting images that show your car registration or your home address or any other kind of location that will identify your child at a particular, as going to a particular school or going to a particular place that can be easily identified, just think about that. There's another question also around when your child grows up, how much exposure they would have wanted on social media as well.
There's no consent.
There's no consent, yeah. So I guess it's the rights of the child to have privacy around the information that's been posted about them as well. So that's another consideration and probably a whole other topic. But I think just being cognizant about what you're posting online and what you're sharing. And of course, we live in this digital age where people are putting lots of information out there. And this isn't certainly to scare people, but I think it's important just to have an awareness.
In essence, then, if you take your phone or your computer to wherever it is, the Genius Bar of Apple or the equivalent for an Android or a PC, and they do wipe something, in theory, then you're giving the perpetrator a defence because that device has been tampered with by someone else.
Well, you're actually losing your evidence. The device that's wiped is no longer a device that's going to be presented at court, and continuity of evidence is very important. And so I think you need to come from the perspective of the person that you're seeking assistance from. What is their approach? So if you go to a particular, you mentioned the Genius Bar, for example, they're there to help you overcome technical problems. They're not necessarily coming from the perspective that you might have evidence that might end up in a court proceeding. So it's really about, when you're seeking advice, what's the core function? What's the core function of the organisation or the individual who's offering you that service? And so, my advice would be to always ensure that you are using organisations or individuals that actually have the background to be able to manage that evidence appropriately and also have experience in being able to give evidence in a court proceeding. I mean, that in itself is, as your listeners can appreciate, is a skill.
Is there anything that we can do just to do a quick look for ourselves?
Yes, the answer to that is absolutely. So the typical sorts of signs that you might see on a mobile phone, for example, is your battery might drain very quickly. The phone might feel quite hot, so it overheats. You might find applications that you didn't install. So it's good practice to go through your applications and anything that you don't identify to take note of that. There's a decision then that needs to be made about whether or not you remove that application or whether you report that application if as part of a broader report to, say, police or domestic violence agencies or your lawyer. And the reason for that is that if that application happened to be spyware and you remove it, you may alert your perpetrator to the fact that that application has disappeared and that control has then been taken away. That can influence the next steps or the behaviour of the perpetrator. So we're never looking to escalate the activities of a perpetrator.
Where on earth does someone go if they think that they are being spied on or there's potentially spyware on their devices? Where on earth do they go? And if they're being financially controlled as well as part of the coercive control, how do they access that support?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we look at the bigger picture. So if somebody is a victim survivor of domestic violence, there's a whole range of supports that person needs. So accessing a domestic violence service agency is a really good start. And many of the domestic violence service agencies have a whole range of resources that they can then access. So as an example, a number of domestic violence agencies that we work with, if they are working with a victim survivor and they're concerned, then they will reach out to us and make a referral to us, and then we will work with that agency and the victim survivor to manage their issues. So that's a really good place to start, is a domestic violence service centre. It also means that we're putting victim survivors of domestic violence into an entire support network, because this stuff causes so much harm. Technology-facilitated abuse, I think the harm that is the consequence of experiencing that is so pervasive and is so damaging that people feel like they're going crazy.
Well, it's the ultimate gaslighting.
Absolutely.